Finding purpose in our trials is the topic that I was given by Brother Clausen, and Chad Hymas just nailed it, right? Like, incredible. It was interesting that he was the speaker before me, because when Frank was telling me the schedule, and he said, Chad Hymas and then you, and I said, you got to be kidding me. Chad Hymas, I just contacted him about using his picture and some of his story for a presentation I'm doing on post-traumatic growth. And he's like, wow, well, it's kind of interesting how it all works out. And it truly is. And I'm grateful for Chad and for his story. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. I appreciate Vice sitting on the front row. He gave me the thumbs up earlier this morning. He was one of my interns a few years ago. And he would sing to the students that were in an intensive need of support. And that would calm them. And I appreciate him. And David Davis, who's here, was another intern. And all of you, thank you so much. I absolutely love this quote. Is there any challenge in your life right now that is large enough that you have no hope of doing it apart from God's help? If not, consider the possibility you are seriously under-challenged. I don't know that any of us are under-challenged, but I want to talk about a few people who have overcome some of life's adversity and found purpose in their trials. You probably know the story of this young man who's here. He's now 80 years old. Lucky Chesley was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam era, spent 7 years in Hanoi. He came through Travis Air Force Base. That was his first landing on the United States ground. And my father was the chaplain at Travis Air Force Base at the time, and he wanted to go to an LDS service for the first time in 7 years. And so he called home. This was, of course, before cell phones. This was in 1973. Got the number, called home, and my family picked him up and took him to church. My dad was doing his non-denominational service on the base, but our family took him with us to church, and then he had dinner that night with us. I'm 14 years old, and he's telling his story. And he's telling his story of being shot down, of being his back being broken upon ejection from the airplane, his being stripped of his clothing, of being beaten, so his arms swelled up 3 times their normal size. This was just within the first 12 hours of being captured. He went on to talk about his torture, about being thrown in a pit full of ants. He talked about entering the compound and hearing through the walls tapping, and also someone saying, cough if you can hear me, cough if you can hear me. Eventually, he was taught this tap code, and the tap code and how you use it is seen on the back. And they would learn to speak to one another through that, and they would get really, really fast, but initially it took a while. And they would tell their whole stories of captivity, perhaps of the torture that they had just received and how they were faring, any medical attention that they needed. They would tell all of that, and they really became a community, and they would help one another. Now, as Lucky is telling the story, he's talking about how grateful he is for everything that he has, and even how grateful he was for that experience, and how wonderful the food is that he's eating with my family. And I'm thinking, okay, my mom's not that great of a cook, and how grateful he was for the 7 years. And I'm thinking, you have the worst life ever. That's what a 14-year-old would think, and that's what I was thinking. But he found ways to find purpose in his trials. And when we do that, his example to me was that when we do that, then our trials are not wasted. And there's nothing worse than a wasted trial. So if we find meaning, they're not wasted. It's important, first of all, in finding purpose in our trials and perhaps leaning into that phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. We know a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic growth is somewhat of a new term. It's only been around about 20 years, and it's only been on the forefront of books and research about the last 5 or 6. But the very first thing that we need to do with regards to post-traumatic growth is acknowledge the trauma that we experienced. And as chaplains and some of your clinicians as well, we can't peel off that box for anyone else. They have to be ready to talk about what that trauma was. And the next thing is to lean into it and then to tell the story. It's really important for the timing to be right. Now, those of you who are musicians, you can probably know what this is right off the bat, but it's a scale. If you take out the timing in that, it just is a scale. Da, 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 da. But you add in the timing, and it's da, 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 da. It changes everything. And timing is very important when it comes to acknowledging the trauma and when people are ready to do that. One of my favorite stories is called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. It was introduced to me by Chaplain Steve Lineback, who's unable to be with us today. He used it in assisting Marines who are coming out of combat. And I've used it with my teenagers who have histories of trauma. It's about a little boy named Billy who wakes up one morning and there's a dragon in his room, and it's about the size of a kitten, and he's pretty excited about it. And he runs downstairs to tell his mom, "Mom, there's a dragon in my room." And she says, "Billy, there is no such thing as dragons." Okay, so he goes upstairs and the dragon helps him get dressed, brings him his clothes. The dragon continues to grow, and by the time Billy goes downstairs for breakfast, it's about the size of a large dog. It jumps up on the table. Billy sits down at the table. Mother doesn't say a word. She can't tell it to get off the table because, after all, there's no such thing. The dragon eats all the pancakes. Billy only gets one. Billy goes upstairs to finish getting ready for the day, and by now the dragon is so large that Mother has to go in and out of windows to get to various places in the house to complete her chores for the day. Billy says, "Mom, I didn't know dragons grew so fast." And she said, "Billy, there is no such thing as a dragon." Well, pretty soon a bakery truck goes past, and apparently dragons cannot resist baked goods. So the dragon takes off and lifts the house with him, with his head out the front of the house and his tail out the back, takes the house off the foundations and runs after the bakery truck. Father comes home for lunch, can't find the house, can't see where anybody is, sees it down the way and goes to it, climbs up the scales of the dragon and says, "What happened?" And Billy said, "Well, it was the dragon." And Mother says, "Billy, there is no such thing as a dragon." And she's getting pretty angry. And Billy says, "Mom, come on. There is a dragon, a really big dragon." And Billy pats the dragon on the head. You turn the page in the book, and there's Mother now, and she's sitting with the dragon, and again, it's about the size of a kitten, and she's got it on her lap, and she's patting its head. And she said, "I don't mind dragons this size. How do you think it got to be so big?" And Billy said, "I think it just needed to be noticed." Our trauma and the trauma of those that we work with is often like that. It needs to be noticed. And as it's pushed down and pushed away and not acknowledged and tried to be forgotten, and substance abuse is used as self-medication and all of those things, eventually, if the trauma can be acknowledged, it becomes manageable. It's still there, but it becomes manageable. If I had a little dragon and it was about the size of a kitten, it could bite my finger and it could probably burn it, but it wouldn't terrorize the neighborhood. It wouldn't terrorize the home and family. Our trauma and the trauma of our people needs to be acknowledged. The next step along the way is to lean into the trauma. We tend to have a lot of avoidance. My students will say, "Don't talk about that. That triggers me." And sometimes I'll say, "I know. I do it on purpose." Because we can't have excessive avoidance of our triggers because we won't get better. I was at a post-traumatic growth symposium in July, and Dr. Aguirre from Harvard said avoidance of suffering prolongs suffering and keeps PTSD alive. Now, he's not meaning here that we pick a day and we go, "Hey, I've been avoiding suffering for a really long time, so today's the day I'm leaning with my whole hand on a hot stove. Today's the day I will suffer. No, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about avoidance of something that's already happened that has caused us great suffering, avoidance of the memories of that is not helpful and keeps PTSD alive. But again, it goes back to timing, right? And we have to become pretty attuned and follow the Spirit and know when the timing is right to say to our soldiers, our clients, our youth, tell me your story. Now, if I say to them, what happened to you? Okay, that's not going to go very well. And I'm not going to get a lot of a response. But if I build a rapport and a trust, and I can say, tell me your story. That seems to be the time when they're ready to peel off the layers of that box. I like the picture of the palm trees. When we lived in the Philippines and we'd have the big typhoons, our palm trees did really, really well. Our banana trees would snap every time we had a typhoon or a bad one. But our palm trees seemed to be able to bend, and they would be okay. And that's part of the resilience of nature. But we need to be like that. When the trauma was there for the prisoners of war, they leaned into it. They knew it was coming. They knew the torture was coming, and they had to go through it. They understood that. The avoidance of it, the fear that came ahead of time was paralyzing to them. But just leaning into it, I can get through this, I can live, and I can also stop and put an end to the torture when I know I can't do anymore. There was this code that they had to follow it, they had to go through with it, but when they were to the breaking point, when they might tell secrets to those considered our enemy at that time, that they could stop. And so they all knew that. They all knew that they could make the call of when the time was done. There's power in telling our story. We learned a little bit about this yesterday and how our brain works with regards to trauma. But when we can put into words, then our frontal cortex is working, the part of our brain that can slow us down and make meaning of things, and it's fully engaged. And that's the part of our brain that we want really engaged with things. When we tell the story, oxytocin is released in the teller and the listener. Now, this is quite amazing because in 1970s, when I was at BYU, the only thing we really knew about oxytocin at that time was the sexual response with husband and wife, and then also the bonding of mother and baby in breastfeeding. We knew about oxytocin then, but we really didn't know what it did and all that it can do, and we're still learning about it. But in telling the story to someone that you trust, or someone is telling you the story because they trust you, that increases the trust, it bonds the relationship, it increases feelings of self-worth, and there's a decrease in depression because the brain releases that oxytocin that does all of those things. True biology and changes take place in the brain with the telling of the stories. You are creating the biology of courage. It looks like that got moved a little bit, but Dr. Egertson at UVU said that at a conference last year, that in the telling and the listening, you are creating the biology of courage. And then Bessel van der Kolk, probably the best known and the latest and greatest in research on trauma, says social support is a biological necessity. We have to have that. That's why community is so important within the armed forces, within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, within the groups that we hold, within family home evening groups, and within the prisoners of war. Sometimes they couldn't see each other for the longest of time. They found ways to communicate. And that oxytocin could still be released in those ways of communicating, whether it was a dragged sandal in a rhythm that they could figure out the code, or whether it was the tapping, or whether it was the singing of what had happened to them. They would sing, for instance, to the tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, what had just happened to them, what they'd experienced, so that the communication could keep going. There are 5 areas of growth. This is the picture that I asked Chad if I could use of him, and Chad talked a lot about his growth. There's actually more than 5 areas, but these are the 5 areas that come up over and over again with the research on post-traumatic growth and finding purpose in our trials. Chad didn't mention today, but he's mentioned it before. If I could go back and change and not have that 2,000-pound bale of hay, break my neck, and make me paralyzed, would I do it? I wouldn't have been able to travel like I've been able to travel. I wouldn't have been able to meet the people I've been able to meet. I wouldn't have my 2 adopted children. I wouldn't be able to help others reach their potential. I don't think I'd change it. I don't think I'd change a thing. That's incredible to me. But that is the power of finding purpose in our trials. The other man on the screen, his name is Chris Siebert, Brother Siebert. Some of you may know him. He teaches in the church educational system. And Brother Siebert has allowed me to share a little bit of his story. He was sold by his parents in India. Crops were really, really bad. And he and his younger brother were sold to an orphanage. They felt like they would probably be adopted. He's thinking this was his parents' thought process. And so where there wasn't going to be enough food for the rest of the family, if these 2 little kids remained, he was sold to an orphanage. Now, this is the same orphanage that the book The Orphan Keeper was written about. And Taj, who wrote the book about the Orphan Keeper, they were friends in there together. So if you've not read that book, I would recommend it. But where Taj was kidnapped and brought to the orphanage, Brother Siebert was sold. And you know what he says about that experience? And even after he's sold, when they come to do an investigation, he's told to run, and he and his little brother are pushed into the streets. And they're 4 years old and 1.5 years old. And his little brother dies. And he has to do unspeakable things to survive. But he does survive, and eventually he's adopted by an LDS family in Salt Lake City, and he says, I am so grateful. I'm a citizen of this wonderful nation. I'm a member of God's kingdom here upon the earth. I get to teach seminary and institute to people who may not yet have an understanding and love of the gospel of Jesus Christ and know of the blessings that are here for us. I have an incredible life. Now, at some point along the way, a choice needed to be made. He could have dug in his heels and been very angry and stayed angry. But he chose to find the purpose in his trials. And he's the seminary teacher that I have with my youth at Heritage. And every single one of my youth that go to seminary, every single one of my youth who are LDS are adopted. And they respond to Brother Siebert like no one else ever has. A positive change in the relationship with others is the second area of growth. One of my young women, she's now an adult. She was one of my young clients. Had been both of her parents were in prison, and she told me that I could share her story. But both of her parents were in prison. She was living with her grandparents. She became a prostitute through being sexually trafficked. She became pregnant at age 14, had an abortion. She was found by the police and returned to her family. And a few days later, she came to my facility. And she heard about a program that we had at that time called the True Love Waits program. We now call it the Sexual Integrity program. And as she's hearing that, she says, whispers very quietly, "Do you really think there are second chances for a girl like me?" She went on to build healthy relationships where she'd never had healthy relationships before with men and truly with others. She continually chose ways that put her in traumatic situations. But from then on, with the idea that she could change and that she could be an inspiration to others, she chose to do things differently from that day forward. And yes, there are second chances. There are third chances. There are fourth chances. We are given many chances by our loving Heavenly Father. Elizabeth Smart is an amazing young woman, and she reminds me of the third area of growth, an increased sense of one's strength and resiliency. You can read this whole quote, but the part here that just amazes me is where she says, "I am grateful for what happened to me, for what it has taught me, the perspective it's given me, the empathy I feel for other survivors. I am grateful I can make a difference. She recently spoke to the youth at my facility, and she connects, and she's so grateful to be able to connect with those who have had sexual trauma, those who have been trafficked, those who are wondering, is there a way back? Can I be okay? Can I have healthy relationships once again? And she is grateful for that experience, and that is that true sense of strength and resiliency. But Chad has it as well. You saw that. Chad's able to move his arms, but he can't feel anything. He can put a pen and grasp onto it because his hands are really tight. He looks like he can do a lot more than he really can do, although then he really can do it. I'm always amazed at what he's able to do when he signs autographs, for instance. All of these people that I'm mentioning here have shown this increase in strength and resiliency. The next area is a greater appreciation for life. I don't know how well you can see this picture, but I want to point out a couple of things here. Oh, this barely shows, but this is my husband, Randy, and it looks like that he is jumping overboard. This is a rafting trip in Colorado, and along the Colorado River, most of the way, you could be eating a sandwich and reading a book. But there's one spot on here that's pretty precarious. And we had taken the cheap way out, and we knew a guy who had rafts and let us take them for free. Well, it's because they held water, but not air. We didn't get a guide because who needs a guide? I mean, the river goes one way, right? Why would you need a guide? You're not going to get lost, right? We totally made a lot of mistakes in this. And we get to this one point, and my husband and I are trying to turn things around. We're not leaning into the trauma, and we're not holding on. We're trying to change the course of events. We don't have the strength to do that. We don't have the power to do that. We can't do that. And so he's thrown overboard, and I'm thrown right here. You can see my feet. And then the rest of me, face down, I'm drowning in the raft. And I remember thinking, it's odd what you think when you're dying. But I remember thinking, my obituary will be so embarrassing. It's going to say, she drowned in the raft. I don't know who would be writing it, but that was my thought. And a moment later, things changed, and I could no longer feel the bottom of my nose on the bottom of the raft. This is what happens next. So I'm thrown now. These are my feet and legs here, and my head is underneath the raft. Now, if you have a guide, if you're not too cheap to have a guide will tell you if you ever find yourself with a raft on top of your head, then you just need to use your hands and walk along, and eventually you'll come to an area where you can pop up and you'll be fine. Didn't know that, just kept trying to come up, and the raft just kept being on my head. And I felt very calm. I knew I was going to die, but I actually felt very calm. And at the point of where you just see utter darkness because your mind is without oxygen, your brain's without oxygen, I popped up. I came up on the other side of the raft, and I thought, okay, get a deep breath because you may be going under again. And I came up and I went, because the wind had been knocked out of me and all of this. The Holy Ghost was with me and brought things to my remembrance, such as just stay calm and try again. When you come up the next time, try again. And each time I would come up and I'd get a little bit more air, and eventually I was fine. Well, no one else was around. The raft could not be seen that I had been thrown from. None of the rest of the passengers. Our sons were on a raft ahead of us. I didn't know where anybody was. But coming down towards me was a raft of about 40 people. They were a boatload of Europeans who were having fun on the Colorado River. And they rescued me, pulled me aboard, and then as the river went and wound around, there was my raft and my cousins, but not my husband. And I said, where's Randy? So we don't know. We lost him when we lost you. I was very concerned. I had been drowning in the raft, then drowning underneath the raft, then rescued by the Europeans, and then brought to safety to the shore, but he still wasn't there. But moments later, he came down, and he had been taken into an eddy. And at the point of, Heavenly Father, I really want to live, but if it's thy will that I should die, okay, please take care of my family, though. He popped up, and he came down, and he was okay. Well, what we found with that is definitely an increased appreciation for life through that experience. All the way home that night, after we talked about how dumb we were, we talked about how grateful we were for life and for both of us making it through that and for the opportunity that we had to continue raising our children. The fifth area of growth is the deepening of a spiritual belief or significant change in one's belief system. Now, those of you who followed BYU back in the winning days, this is Corby Eason, and Corby Eason played football for BYU, was a starter, and Corby has quite an interesting story. He grew up in a place called Crack City in Georgia. I mean, that was the nickname for it, and he was a very good athlete, and being an athlete, he was at football practice one day when his friends got into a lot of trouble, and they were involved in a gang shooting where an innocent bystander was killed. Corby was a part of that gang, should have been there, except he thought, I need to be with my team, and I need to be at football practice. And so where his friends went on to prison, Corby went on to play football at a junior college in New York. Well, he heard one day that one of the BYU coaches was going to be there. And so he waited outside the coach's door, and the coach kept saying, go, Corby. I don't want you around here. I want you to go. But he had put all of his best tackles and blocks and everything on his phone. And as soon as the coach came out, he followed him and said, Coach, my name's Corby Eason. I can't remember what it is he played, but I play this position, and I want to show you something. And I really want to play for BYU. Now, Corby wasn't a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And when I asked him about that later, I said, Corby, why BYU? And he said, I needed structure. See, Corby's dad was a drug dealer. Corby thought he worked in the construction business. And he had a big house and lots of fun toys, lots of expensive things. They lived in a nice area of town. But when Corby was 11 years old, he came home and everybody was crying and the police were there. And his life ended. His dad was taken off to prison. That's how he felt as an 11-year-old boy. My life ended today. And his father was in prison for the next 10 years. And Corby went to live in a 2-bedroom house with 11 other people in the slums. Going from a boy of riches to a boy of poverty was very hard for him, but what was more difficult for him to understand was the double life that his dad had been living, and that his dad wasn't going to be there for him for a long time, and he lacked the structure of having a father in the home. And so when that coach was there, he said, I want to be here because I need the structure. Corby ended up coming to Brigham Young University. And he told me later, I know why God made me short. If God had made me tall, I would have been playing for the University of Alabama, and I would have gone on to play NFL football. But I would have missed hearing of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So God made me short so that I would go to a little junior college in New York and then be picked up to go to BYU. And I could be baptized, and I could marry Becca in the temple. And he said, sometimes I get so frustrated in priesthood meetings because I'm like, guys, this is true. Don't you get it? This is so amazingly wonderful. And he goes, sometimes there's just a lack of inspiration and appreciation and excitement for the gospel. Well, Corby had that true spiritual belief and a deepening and a change in his belief system. I want to spend just a moment in Ether 1 through 6. You know the story. This is a picture of Hurricane Irma. But I think of the Jaredites and how they found purpose in their trials. You know, Jared and the brother of Jared, they did everything the Lord required them to do and asked them to do. They gathered the bees. I don't know what that would look like. How do you just go and gather bees? But they gathered the bees, and then they put them in their barges that they had built. And I don't know who was assigned to those particular barges with the bees and what that would look like and how that would work. Short straw, I don't know. And then the animals, and then all the food for the animals, and then the food for them, and then, of course, the light, the rocks, and the stones that were touched by the finger of the Lord. They did every single thing the Lord asked them to do, and it was very difficult. I liken the building of barges and all that was required of them as maybe someone giving me a cotton seed and saying, okay, go make a layette for your grandchildren, all the maternity clothes and the bedding from the cotton seed. So I'd have to start with the plants, right? And grow the cotton and go from there. And yes, it's possible, but it would be so hard. And they did those really hard things, but because of course they had the Lord's help and the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, but nonetheless it was difficult. And so they do all of those things that they're asked to do. And then what do we read in chapter 6? And then the furious winds came. I picked a picture of Irma because I think those were furious winds. But the furious winds began to blow, and they were buried in the sea, and they were scared, and so they would plead unto the Lord for their safety. And they were driven forth for 344 days in those conditions. I imagine some seasickness, at least in the beginning. The terror of unstopping and then having the water come in and stopping it back up, and yet they used their fear to bring them to their knees. And when they reached the promised land 344 days later, that's the first thing they did, was bend their knees in prayer on the promised land. Our trials, if we will let them, can bring us to the promised land. I see that with Corby, and I see that with Chad. I see that with many of you who I know are struggling greatly in personal problems, in health issues, in trials with your children. But it is often that furious wind that can bring us to where we need to be. And I'm so very grateful for that. I want you to be thinking of your story or someone you know who has experienced some of life's adversities, some of the people that you work with. What have you learned about yourself as you've overcome adversity and you found purpose in your trials? And what have you learned from someone else's story? We have a few minutes for questions, and you're fine to ask me a question, but I think it would be very beneficial for this group to hear from one another about the things they've learned through overcoming adversity or learned from someone else. And then I'll take a minute at the end to close. We have some microphones ready. Is there anyone that would like to share first? Bye. Yes. Oh, wait for the microphone. It's coming.
Can you just speak a little bit about the post-traumatic growth and forgiveness and what that looks like from your experience for some of your students?
Well, wonderful question. And as we know, when we forgive someone, they may never change, right? The young woman like Elizabeth Smart, who has forgiven her perpetrators but doesn't want to spend time with them, right? But she's put that in the Lord's hand and has forgiven them. It's changed her. Forgiveness changes us. And that is very beneficial in the growth. Not everyone will experience post-traumatic growth. I need to mention that. But it's a phenomenon that comes up so many times, especially of people of faith, that it has to be addressed, because most people will bounce back to a level of resiliency where they were before. So something really difficult takes place, and they're down for a while, but they bounce back over time. But post-traumatic growth is coming even beyond that to an area of being better than they ever were, stronger than they ever were, dealing with adversities better than they ever had, finding purpose in these trials and being able to help others. And certainly forgiveness is a part of that. When we hold on to hate, that binds us to the perpetrators. When we forgive, we're freed. So thank you.
I was taught something very valuable from you today. I suppose there's somebody in the room that's closer to Chris Siebert than I am, but I don't know who you are, if you are. But I've worked with him for more than a dozen years, and he doesn't have that define who he is.
Right.
His story doesn't define him. Because, like I said, I've worked with him, shared common students with him for a dozen years, and I didn't know half of what you told us about him. And to me, it was just inspirational to say, Chris has always been one of my heroes without knowing what you told me about him. And that doesn't define him. What defines him is his passion, his love for his students.
Right.
And his genuine, sincere devotion to Christ. And that's why he's been my hero in the past. And now it's just furthered that. I'm anxious to have a conversation with him in the coming days.
Remind him that he did give me permission to tell this story and use the picture. Okay.
I will remind him.
A little bit more about Brother Siebert. He served a mission in India, so he's sent back to his motherland that he still loves. He says, you always love your mother, no matter how hard your mother is. You always love your mother. And he was kidnapped as a missionary, and he was thrown in jail. After that was another situation. He was thrown in jail, and his passport was stolen, and they weren't going to let him out of the country. It all worked out. But his story continues to be one of strength and inspiration. Thank you. Yes.
Yes. This is an interesting topic. To me, I did my doctoral dissertation on something related with post-traumatic growth. And one of the things I found in doing my dissertation was that community was rated by the case studies that I interviewed as one of the highest elements for experiencing healing and growth. I haven't had a lot of opportunity to do groups and those sorts of things, and I'm just wondering if you could speak to any experience that you've had with helping to form community, because I know in a lot of these examples they have had profound church community, but a lot of the people that we may minister to may not have, strong families or church or other elements to help them.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we as chaplains can do is that we can at least, I know my dad used to do this. My dad retired in 81, but he would bring groups together, and he would call them whatever he wanted to call them. But they might be a grief and loss group, for instance. And so as you hear of different people who are coming to you, and I had this loss, I had this experience, whatever it may be, he would pull them together into groups. He would assign them for Protestant Youth of the Chapel to maybe help with that. And so they were with other people. He would find community and make it a service opportunity. So for instance, like let's say the person's name was Joe, Airman Joe. We have this great need this weekend with this youth group, or with these people who are really struggling in this area, or with this widow. She's off base, but our home, it needs to be painted. And so we need you, and I've got some other people that are going to be there. And he would start helping to build community with some of his people. But he would hold a lot of groups. For instance, family home evening groups, he never called them that, but that's what it would be for his airmen. Because they needed that sense of community. And then from there, they would often start attending worship services where the community would become a bit larger. One young man, my dad was the first Utah full-time state prison chaplain in Utah. And he would visit those who were in lockdown and could only have one meal a day and no visitors except from the chaplain. Now, this was in the 60s. It can't be done now, but that's the way it was then. And along the way, as he was building a rapport with them, he would invite them to come to worship services. And they would then build community. One man by the name of Roger Collings Anderson, I hope you remember that name because Roger's a hero to me, went from being known as a notorious bandit, the silk stocking bandit of the late 50s and early 60s, to being an ordnance worker in the Jordan River Temple, and worked for the Granite School District, and had 2 sons that served a mission. And it all happened because of that community that was built. So you're right, that is really important. But you will be creative, and our Father in heaven will help you to know where you can and how to build it and what to call it to bring people together. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
Are there any commonalities or attributes you find in individuals that experience post-traumatic growth versus those that either degrade or stay the same? Just on an individual basis, things that make people more likely to experience that growth or come out.
So those 3 steps that I mentioned, acknowledging, they need to be ready to acknowledge the trauma that they've experienced, and then leaning into it. So it's already happened, it's already gone, but they've got to lean into the memory. They've got to be able to go there again and acknowledge it, right? And then telling the story. Telling the story always involves community because we've got to tell it to someone. And so if they have that society of friends, which is what our quorums and our Relief Society and our young men and young women are so important for in building that community, that's very helpful. But some people are just more resilient, and there are some studies about it. For some, they say, I didn't want to. Chad, at one time, he was on the side of being angry forever, right? And eventually he chose to move forward and be a better dad and be a better provider and do all of those things that he actually couldn't have done the way that he was. Being a support yourself to them and gently asking for the story to be told. Once the story can start to be told, that seems to be a key factor in all of this. Not for everybody, nothing's for everybody, but and people that have faith. People of faith tend to be more resilient. Okay.
We had one more.
One more, and then I've got one slide. Okay, where's the one more? Oh, at the very back,
The one
yes.
holding the mic.
Sorry.
In talking about that idea of timing, and I think you were just now starting to touch on some of those aspects of it, but when you have someone who's just really stuck in that place and they're not, the timing isn't right yet, they're not in that place yet where they're ready to move on and to work towards that growth, any suggestions or ideas on how to help them get to that place?
You know, you can nudge a little bit and you can poke a little bit and you can be a presence with them and all of that, but in the end, they decide when they're ready to lift the lid on that. Just one last slide. The Doctrine and Covenants tells us to hold on our way. We have the story of the prophet Joseph where he's saying, where are you? Lord, are you hiding from us? We need you, in section 122. And the Lord goes on to say, even if you're taken by sword and thrown into a pit and you're with murderers and all of those things, I'm with you. And you have not descended below what I have. And all these things shall be for thy good and for thy experience, right? All of these things, those horrible, horrible things, shall be for thy good. And then it goes on to say, therefore, hold on thy way. Don't let go. These are my sons, 2 of them anyway, the ones that are the tallest in the group. They were holding on. They saw this crisis as a great opportunity. They had tons of fun. They were like, oh, you guys almost drowned. Wow, we had such a good time. You wouldn't have believed it. You know? The Chinese symbol for crisis is this right here, but it means danger and opportunity. There's 2 ways to look at it. I guess that's part of that choice that I was mentioning it. And I want to end with G, B, and U. That's how the prisoners of war would end every conversation they had with one another. G, B, U. May God bless you. May God bless you in your families, in your responsibilities, in your stations, with your soldiers, with your airmen, with your hospital patients, with the other chaplains that you are mentoring. May God bless you. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.